Thank you very much.
I know you're going to ask a really nice question.
Well, it's an important question, I think. Are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back?
What's getting walked back?
It made it sound like, just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon, and it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia, and we know...
None of the three occurred.
None of the three occurred?
None of the three.
Mr. President?
You interpret the language that way. I was talking to the troops. We were talking about helping train the troops that are the Ukrainian troops that are in Poland. That's what the context. I sat there with those guys for a couple hours. That's what we talked about.
So when you said you're going to see when you're there, you were not intending to
I was referring to meeting with and talking with the Ukrainian troops that were in Poland.
And when you said a chemical weapon use by Russia would trigger a response in kind?
It will trigger a significant response.
What does that mean?
I'm not going to tell you. Why would I tell you? You got to be silly.
The world wants to know.
The world wants to know a lot of things. I'm not telling them what the response would be. Then Russia knows the response.
It is so funny how through Donald Trump's inane ramblings and incoherent diatribes, Fox News never once had any issue understanding him. But God forbid Joe Biden says even a single word that they don't find suitable, and they send Peter Doocy to ask whether the world can even trust America anymore. Funny how that works out. The principal comment that apparently set Peter Doocy and Fox News off was this one.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
For God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power, because somehow Doocy is pretending to interpret this as meaning the US is seeking regime change in Russia. Give me a break. Who in the world listens to that speech and thinks that it means the US is advocating a policy of regime change? It means what everyone who's got two brain cells thinks it means, that Putin should not be in power. It's an expression of outrage, and a correct one. He is a war criminal. He's slaughtering civilians and mothers and babies. He bombed hospitals and schools and maternity wards. The entire world knows that this dangerous man, this warmonger, this tyrant should not be in power. So maybe Biden's comment is less about regime change and more about a man espousing some common sense. And by the way, in fairness, it's not just Peter Doocy on this one. The entirety of the Beltway media is having a self-obsessed circle jerk over this, with each one poring over the same question to prove their very serious person credentials. Listen to some of these questions.
Thank you, sir. Do you believe what you said, that Putin can't remain in power? Or do you now regret saying that because your government has been trying to walk that back? Did your words complicate matters?
Well, you asked three different questions. I'll answer them all. Number one, I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing in the actions of this man. Just brutality. Half the children in Ukraine. I had just come from being with those families. But I want to make it clear, I wasn't then, nor am I now, articulating a policy change. I was expressing the moral outrage that I feel, and I make no apologies for it.
Back to your original words that he cannot remain in power. Can you help us understand, you have more foreign policy experience than any president who has ever held this office. Whether those are your personal feelings or your feelings as president, do you understand why people would believe you, as someone commanding one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, saying someone cannot remain in power is a statement of U.S. policy? And also, are you concerned about propaganda use of those remarks by the Russians?
No and no.
Tell me why. You have so much experience. You are the leader of this country.
Because it's ridiculous. Nobody believes we're going to take down, I was talking about taking down Putin. Nobody believes that. Number one. Number two, what have I been talking about since this all began? The only war that's worse than one intended is one that's unintended. The last thing I want to do is engage in a land war or a nuclear war with Russia. That's not part of it. I was expressing my outrage at the behavior of this man It's outrageous. It's outrageous. And it's more an aspiration than anything. He shouldn't be in power. There's no, I mean, people like this shouldn't be ruling countries, but they do. The fact they do, but doesn't mean I can't express my outrage about it.
I mean, dear God. I'll just say this, the Beltway media is far too self-important to recognize that this isn't a real issue. They want you to know that actually what he did was very serious because they've decided when they find outrage in something, that's indisputable proof that the outrage is justifiable. That, and let's be honest, they're desperate for some drama. And so they'll turn this into a scandal if it's the last thing they do because they're surrounded by other reporters who are also insisting this is a scandal. And so as far as they know, insulated in their bubbles, this is a scandal for everyone. Everyone except, of course, the rest of the American public. Find me one person who doesn't agree with the sentiment that Putin shouldn't remain in power. So while the media obsesses over every word in search of some clicks, just remember that these are the same people who told you that Benghazi was the most serious foreign relations blunder in US history, and that Hillary's emails was a national security failure second to none. If you're looking for proof that the media is out of touch, you don't have to look far. That aside, one more telling point in this is Peter Doocy asking Biden to elaborate on what Biden's response would be if Putin used chemical weapons, pretending, of course, that when Biden said we'd respond in kind, that means the US is going to launch a chemical weapons attack. I mean, for goodness sake, is that really what Peter Doocy took out of that statement? That an in-kind response means the US is going to violate the Geneva Convention? Of course it means a response commensurate to their attack, and of course it doesn't mean we're going to launch a chemical weapons attack. I swear, these Fox hosts are so desperate to score some cheap political win on Biden that they make themselves sound like absolute morons in the process. Doocy goes on to ask what specifically that response would entail, at which point Biden says he's not going to just tell Peter Doocy, because you know, and I know, and Fox knows that if he did tell Peter Doocy, then those same people would attack Biden for just divulging our military strategy. You literally cannot win with these people. Either they're miserable because they're not being told every step of the way what's happening, or if you do tell them what's happening, well then they'll attack you for being too forthright. I'm starting to think, and I hope you're sitting down for this, they're not coming at this in good faith and are only concerned with scoring some cheap win. So look, I think it's great that Biden took these questions, and these reporters have every right in the world to ask them. But for those of us on the outside, let this be a good lesson in terms of the next quote-unquote scandal that we're told is a big deal. Because sometimes it's not so much about the scandal itself as it is a media establishment desperate to tell you that you ought to be mad about something because the drama is good for business. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.